Thing kicked off. My name is Benjamin Todd. I'm a member of Enterprise Outreach with GSA. Just here to cover a few housekeeping notes before we get started this morning. First of all, this webinar is being recorded. Just had to insert that disclaimer so everybody knows. Please submit any questions you have throughout the webinar to the Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to get those addressed either during the webinar or at the end. Outside of that, you should have a live transcript running at the bottom of your screen if you are interested in using that. We do have a poll to get us kicked off today, so we'll give you 30 seconds to a minute to answer that. To all those just joining us, we have launched a 2-question poll. We're curious about the role in your organization and your level of familiarity with government-wide security policy. Feel free to answer those. We'll give you another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get things kicked off. Thank you. Alrighty, we've got over 90 responses. I'm going to end the poll and share the results, and then I'll pass it over to Gio, our host, to get things kicked off.
Great, thank you so much, Benjamin. So just really quickly, let's take a look at this poll really quickly. I'm just curious to see exactly where folks, what roles are in. So I see a lot of procurement analysts, contract specialists, a lot of folks in government. I see a few folks who are program managers, program analysts, and security SMEs. This is great. And on the side of how familiar you are with security policy, I see that it seems like most folks, 62%, are somewhat familiar and have a passing knowledge. That's good. And then there are folks that don't have any knowledge at all, which is great as well, because you get to learn something new today. And then, of course, there are 11 people who are very familiar with this, which is great. Okay, great. So let's get things kicked off. So my name is Giovanni Onwuchekwa, and I am the Senior Strategic Advisor to the Executive Director for Acquisitions within the Office of the IT category at GSA. And a big part of my role is figuring out what is coming next in the IT landscape and in the contracting space. My job is to really look 3, 4, 5 years into the future to anticipate how the IT market is going to change, what new regulations, what new rules we can expect, and to build the contract vehicles of the future that meet the needs of our agency partners in that future. And as part of doing that work and having many conversations in that role, one thing has become really clear. Technology has forever transformed the human race. It's made our lives better in so many ways, whether it's your laptops or your cell phones and smartphones you're able to use, or the fact that we could all continue working during the recent pandemic using technologies like video conferencing and Zoom and the like. And one thing it's also done is enabled our agency missions, right? So whether it's moving from on-prem to the cloud, whether it's IT modernization, it's helping in all spheres of government. But while we've made a lot of advancements in technology and technology has benefited our missions significantly, there's one thing that it's also presented, and it is a bit of an Achilles heel. And that is that the very technology that enables what we do can also be used against us. Right now, as we speak, there are thousands probably of entities and individuals all across the world who are hell-bent on penetrating our infrastructure, stealing our data and controlling our resources, our technology resources. I mean, whether you look at the 2015 OPM breach that essentially hackers went in and got access to the personal information of over 21 million people, and many other breaches that have happened since then, cybersecurity is taking a much more visible stance, or space, I should say, in our collective consciousness. And the federal government has had many different responses to it, and we can expect many coming in the future. And that really is the purpose of this conversation today. There are many rules that are coming down the pike. There are many regulations that are coming down the pike for how we buy technology, how we implement technology, and how we even conceive of technology policy and strategy within our agencies. And part of our conversation today is going to be to better understand what some of those rules are that are coming down the pike, how they impact you if you are a CISO, or you are an IT program manager, or you are a contracting officer, or procurement analyst, or you have some other role in government that pertains to cybersecurity and compliance. We're going to essentially paint a roadmap for what we see coming down the pike in terms of regulations, and really talk about what that means for you, where you sit in your role, and ultimately show you how we at GSA are preparing for these new rules and regulations, and ultimately how we will help you remain compliant with them. And to do that, I have an illustrious panel of cybersecurity experts who are by far some of the smartest people on cyber within GSA. They have been in the trenches with these breaches that have happened. They are at the center of government-wide policy that's been being drafted, and they are some of the most knowledgeable people that you can ever hope to talk to about these kinds of things. And so part of what I want to do today first is introduce the panel. Excuse me, I'll have them introduce themselves, and then we have some questions for them, and we'll get right into it. So why don't we go ahead and start with Rosa Underwood.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rosa. I'm currently acting Senior Cybersecurity Advisor to ITC. I've been in government for about 4 years now, most of my career spent in industry. I'm well aware of the trends that are ongoing from the industry perspective, as well as the challenges faced by agencies when it comes to cybersecurity.
Great, thank you, Rosa. All right, Matt Jones.
Yeah, thank you, Gio, and good morning, everyone. So yes, Matt Jones. I'm in the Supply Chain Risk Management Division within ITC at GSA. Our division's role involves really bridging the gap to help integrate supply chain risk management from a cyber perspective into our acquisitions, right? So that's an important sort of piece to sort of make those connections. So that's my role.
Great, thank you, Matt. Barry Hodge.
Good morning, everyone. Barry Hodge. I'm with the IT products group in the software division, responsible for helping agencies procure software and cloud. In the way of background, spent 22 years plus in the federal government. Spent most of that time in operations, on the operational side of implementing cybersecurity in the end user environment.
Thank you, Barry.
Thanks.
Tom Smith.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Again, Tom Smith, also from the IT products team, branch chief companion of Barry Hodge in the IT products and software division, primarily responsible now for service delivery on that front. Bring 30 years worth of Department of Defense acquisition experience as a chief engineer in other capacities, and be in the supply chain risk management, SME within the broader IT category.
Great, thank you, Tom. And last but not least, Patricia Waddell.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Patricia Waddell. I'm the acting director for IT services. Our office is responsible for creating and managing the government-wide contracts. We manage both the small and large business GWACs that most of you are probably familiar with: Alliant, vets 2, 8A stars 3. I've been at GSA probably longer than I can remember, have a background in contracting, business and operations, and a whole host of other things. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Patricia. All right, so why don't we go ahead and kick this off? So I think the first question on my mind, at least, and Rosa, I'll start off with you. What would you say are the biggest cyber threats that we're seeing in the federal government right now, and how bad are these threats?
I would say any entity seeking to do harm to not just the federal government, but to the nation overall, when you look at the citizens, whether it's a business, whether it's the infrastructure, I would say, and I know you're looking for some maybe specific threats, but there are quite a few threats out there, whether you're looking at a Chinese entity or some other nation state entity. But when you start looking at it in the grand scheme of things, for example, I'll go back to Colonial Pipeline. That particular ransomware attack stalled a lot of activities, at least for the East Coast, right? So those type of attacks are detrimental to the overall nation. There are external attacks and there are also internal type of threats that agencies in particular need to worry about. But overall, any entity that, whether it's a business, whether even if it's your home, should be aware of those type of attacks, whether it's a disgruntled employee, for example, or like I said, a nation state who may be seeking to shut down a pipeline or something of that nature.
That makes a lot of sense to me, Rosa. So you mentioned something really interesting. You said the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. Pretend I'm a 5-year-old. What is a ransomware attack?
So ransomware, so a ransomware attack, it's like extortion. So what this particular group did, they were able to access the Colonial Pipeline company's network. And the reason they were able to access it was because this particular segment of the network did not have multi-factor authentication. So they were just able to access it by way of using a password, as opposed to a password plus something else, like a phone number or email, a code, whatever the case may be. And what essentially they did, they accessed the network and they added malware that caused the network to not function, so to speak. The company was not able to access data. They were not able to access the network. And because of that, it proliferated such that they were not able to maintain certain aspects of the gas pipeline. That's when you start seeing the shortages. You start seeing some lines for gas. And in some cases, you saw violence because people were cutting in front of lines. So those are the type of things that, overall are detrimental to us as a nation.
And it's very clear that they have some real world impacts. And correct me if I'm wrong, Rosa, but I know with ransomware, part of the word ransom in there implies that there's an exchange of funds. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Normally with the ransomware, what they'll do is seize the network, and whatever entity is seizing the network, they'll send a message saying, if you want access to your network, then you need to pay X amount of dollars. And I don't want to say dollars, but when you translate or convert what they're really asking, they're usually asking for cryptocurrency. In the case of Colonial Pipeline, the ransomware was around $4 million. And luckily, the FBI was able to hack the hacker, so to speak, and obtain a good portion of that money back. But that's basically holding your network for ransom or extortion, if you will, same thing, until you pay. And even still, once you pay the ransomware, it's not guaranteed that the entity will let you access the network. And in some cases, they will, if they steal data, they will still publish that data. And you've seen that most recently, I believe, with a couple of police departments where there was a ransomware attack. You pay them and they still end up releasing some of the data that was stolen.
Wow, I mean, that's a pretty big impact, I would say, on just how we function as a nation. So let me ask you this then. We've seen slowly, at least the cybersecurity came into my consciousness, I would say probably around 2015 when we had the OPM breach, or at least it became much more sort of prevalent for me. And since then, it almost seems like we've seen a steady uptick in incidents. Where do you see us going in terms of, how do you see the trends? What trends are you seeing in terms of incidents that are occurring in government and just quite frankly in the nation as a whole?
So initially, when you go back further, most of the cyber attacks were what they call DDoS, denial of service. And what that was is just an entity would constantly send some type of, we call it traffic, but something toward a particular node within a network, basically to keep it from functioning normally. That wasn't early on. And then there was some stealing of sensitive data as well. But the transition, I think, happened from around 2018, maybe, the transition to ransomware, because it's more of, it's easier and it's more lucrative. So you're asking for millions of dollars, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars with ransomware. Going back to the OPM breach, that particular breach was a stealing of sensitive data. And the cost associated with that breach still today is estimated at over $1 billion. So there was no ransomware involved, but still the recovery efforts associated with that, the cost of the recovery is pretty high.
I see. Thank you for that, Rosa. I want to go to Matt next, actually, on this, because I think even though we're seeing cyber incidents occur, whether it's attacking software or code, we're also seeing cyber incidents occur in a much more sort of nefarious manner in the supply chain. So Matt, could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing and how those threats or vulnerabilities, I should say, are evolving in your space?
Yeah, absolutely, Gio. Yeah, so from a supply chain perspective, it's important to remember that each threat that we hear about, right, each threat that exists requires a vulnerability to exploit in order to have an impact. And so I would say that, again, from a supply chain perspective, that software and hardware integrity should also be included in this discussion today. And we see the impact from things like malicious code and counterfeit products, the impact that those can have on an agency's mission. And we also know that these types of vulnerabilities can be exploited and result in things like theft of agency information and theft of U.S. civilian information. These cause significant damage and very real impacts. And so, again, from a supply chain perspective, it's not just that we need to protect our own IT assets internally. We also need to push that protection into our supply chains. That's not easy. In fact,
Gotcha.
It's very difficult.
Gotcha. So let me hop in here and ask you a question, right? So you've said a supply chain a number of times, right? And I just want the folks who are listening to this who perhaps may not be as familiar with what we're doing in the supply chain. Can you give us an example of how a vulnerability makes it into the supply chain, and give us a concrete example of what that might look like?
Well, yeah, Gio, that's sort of the question of so what do we do about this, right? I want to get into some of the resources that we have, rather than go down some specific examples, if that's okay this morning. But really, I think the good news is that we have some solid resources available. There's guidance out there that that can be useful, helping us implement cybersecurity into our supply chain. I think one good example of this is the NIST 161 Revision 1. This publication provides guidance for developing a SCRIM capability into our enterprise risk management programs. And honestly, this is an area where GSA's investments have been very impressive. I see GSA as having an important role to help suppliers really be risk aware and to better communicate cyber risk related information to their public sector clients. So when thinking about supply chain, it's an admirable goal really for us is probably to have federal agencies and industry continue working together and aligning effectively so that agency security needs can be paired well with supplier security practices.
And that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, the reality is that the federal government purchases millions of IT products and services, or really IT products, that's what we're really talking about here within the context of supply chain, every single year. And what I'm hearing you say, Matt, is you have these sort of malicious actors who are injecting malicious code or things that are exploiting vulnerabilities much further on in the supply chain. So for instance, if we buy a camera from a manufacturer, that camera could have been altered in the manufacturing process to allow outside entities to penetrate those cameras and potentially take a look at what we're doing. I recently actually saw an article that said that, I think the headline of the article is, your desk phone may be transmitting data to China, right? Which I thought was just mind blowing for me. So really, thank you for all the work that you're doing in that space. So I think we really have a good sense of where sort of these threats exist and where we're going with this. So Rosa, I want to hop back to you really quickly. So in May of 2021, the president issued the executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. So if I'm a contracting officer, I'm a program manager, IT professional sitting in an agency somewhere, what new rules or regulations do I need to be worried about, or do I need to sort of anticipate and start thinking about?
I would say all of it. And there has been a lot of guidance that has come out. There's been a lot of policy changes that have happened, and quite frankly, there will be more. So when you look at the executive order, it breaks down sections. That's pretty much the plan. And each section kind of gives you a sense of what happens next. And then what happens next was several memorandum. Most recently, if you look at M22, OMB M2218. So before I get into that, I just want to, take a step back and say why it's important. Acquisition professionals are, in many cases, the first line of defense when it comes to developing the requirements or assisting agencies with developing their requirements. Those requirements must include, in a lot of cases, these policies to ensure that there is a well-protected and resilient federal space. And when I say federal space, I'm talking the federal government, and then it's inclusive of contractors as well as those businesses that are doing or selling to the government. We have to make sure that they have these requirements in place. Matt mentioned the NIST documentation for supply chain risk management. That is key to ensuring that you have certain controls in place to, for example, make sure that you don't allow a particular entity or manufacturer into the ecosystem. Section 889 kind of talks to those entities, whether it's a Huawei or a ZTE. But it's important for the acquisition professionals, the operation teams, the supporting contractors, and I mentioned the vendors, to be fully aware of the cybersecurity requirements, the policy changes, all that have stemmed from the executive order that was released last year. Because like I said, each of those requirements, they serve a purpose. And that purpose is to get the nation the goal of achieving a well-protected and resilient, not just federal government, but nation overall.
You know, that makes a lot of sense to me, Rosa. And, you know, as I was reading the executive order the other day, I think one particular thing jumped out at me. And I'd just be curious about your thoughts about what to expect from this. So I think one of the things that's part of the executive order is specifically, it says to improve software supply chain security.
Mhm.
And I believe there's talk of software bill of materials, and getting those sorts of things from software companies. And I know there are federal acquisition regulation cases that are sort of in the pipeline right now
Mhm.
to think through what these new regulations might look like. So within that context, what is an IT program manager or an acquisition professional have to worry about or have to think about in this new world?
So when you look at the last memo that was released, for cybersecurity requirements, the enhancing software security, that is the OMB M2218. Not just the acquisition professionals need to worry about, there are some activities that they are responsible for, actions are responsible for, but also the vendors that manufacture software. So let's look at the acquisition professionals or the agencies. The agencies are now required to obtain an attestation from software manufacturers that attest that they followed this guidance for securely developing software. And in particular, the guidance is in short, SSDF, which is the Secure Software Development Framework. And there are steps in there to ensure that at the beginning of the life cycle of development, that certain steps are taken to incorporate cybersecurity requirements into the development of that software. That's what agencies are required to do. There's some other things that the memo outlines. The agencies, as a part of the pre-award process, can ask for SBOMs, and you kind of talk about SBOMs. So what are SBOMs? SBOM, software bill of materials. Basically, it's a list, or it's like a recipe. What is included in that software that is being delivered? And it just kind of identifies some of not the code, but maybe some other things that made up this particular software that is being sold to the government or the government's about to use. I won't get too detailed
Rosa,
into that.
No, I appreciate that. And Rosa, you just mentioned something really important is these software bill of materials, otherwise known as SBOMs.
Mhm.
And so what is an acquisition professional or an IT program manager going to have to actually do, right? What I heard you say is, look, the agencies are going to require these software manufacturers to attest to this. Are we asking for the entirety of their source code, and will government agencies have to review that source code to ensure that it's actually, what's the actual burden or sort of new work that's going to be created out of this? Just curious.
So right now, the required burden right now is to obtain an attestation. Agencies, as a part of their solicitations, can also request additional artifacts. And those artifacts, for example, may be, and the memo outlines, evidence that a particular vendor participates in a vulnerability disclosure program. So agencies may also, like I said, ask for SBOMs, but it depends on the mission of the agencies, the requirements, what they're looking for. But right now, the thing that is required, without a doubt, are the attestations that, effective the date of that memo, which I think is September 14th, any software that's developed after that, those manufacturers or developers, I should say, are following the NIST guidance.
So, Rose, I'm gonna ask you a really, I guess, it's a silly question, right? If all we're asking for is attestation, then to what degrees does that help us? What was the thinking around sort of that crafting that policy in terms of to what degree does that help us actually better protect our software supply chain?
So there's a couple of ways. And I think I didn't answer what your questions as far as code review. So let me take a step back for that. Right now, no, we're not looking, the memo is not saying you need to go out and understand the code and say, yes, the certain security aspects are in the code. And we're not asking, they're not asking that, I should say, OMB that is. But what the attestation does, when you look at that software secure, that development framework, it's ensuring that those controls, that the companies are looking at, for example, ensuring that their code does not have a back door in it where a developer who may become a disgruntled worker decides to use that back door to implement some malicious or malware that may cause harm to the federal government. So, and then it's also looking at, not just looking at the code, but testing, how it's tested to ensure certain vulnerabilities. One, looking for vulnerabilities in the software, and then two, ensuring that those vulnerabilities are captured properly and a plan is outlined or laid out to fix any vulnerabilities that could be found in that software. So there's a lot of, I would say, moving parts to it. The vendors need to understand what that guidance, the requirements of that guidance as they move toward developing their software. It's good. I would recommend agencies, the procurement or acquisition workforce, to get a sense, at least review it, ask questions about it to get an understanding as well.
See, so and that's certainly a good recommendation. So Rosa, one final question on this, and then we do have to move on to other folks on the panel. But one final question about this: what is GSA doing to help agencies navigate the complexity of complying with, again, these new regulations that are coming out, specifically about the cyber EO?
So we've done a couple of things. We started looking at across the board all of our contracts to make sure that they align properly with the changing policies and the cybersecurity requirements from the memo. We want to make sure that our programs are aligned with those policies. Matt mentioned a couple of things as well. When you start to look at, for example, Section 889, even though when you look at Section 889 and when that requirement was implemented, it still falls in line with cybersecurity and ensuring that the nation is resilient and well protected. So we're just looking at, for example, pre-award, looking at our contracts, doing risk illumination. And what I mean by risk illumination, looking to vetting those vendors to ensure, one, for example, that they are following certain cybersecurity or supply chain risk management procedures. Also looking at those vendors to, for example, to make sure that there's no foreign ownership or influence. Looking at, for example, maybe you just never know with mergers and acquisitions, things change all the time. There could be a board of directors member that may be associated with the nation state or an adversary. So we're looking to make sure that we're doing the vetting and we're looking to ensure that our programs are aligned with the cybersecurity policies and objectives.
And I appreciate that, Rosa. I think the overall theme is what I'm hearing you say is we're doing a lot of work to ensure compliance at our contract level so that the agencies that use our vehicles ultimately don't necessarily have to take on that same burden of compliance is what I think I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, so we're making it a little easier, definitely. We're making it a little easier, but it's still a requirement, for agencies based on their mission to make sure that their requirements and the contracts are aligned as well.
And then that's an important point. And it's my understanding that your team as well as others are providing subject matter expertise support to those agencies to allow that to happen. So really appreciate the answers to that question and really the thoughtful discussion. Let me move over to Matt and Tom. So Rosa kind of already sort of led us down in this path around supply chain risk management, and it really was the focus of Section 889 of the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. And it's mentioned again from a software perspective in the cyber EO. So let me ask you guys this, and Matt or Tom, feel free to unmute and just answer the question. Why is supply chain risk management so important, and what is GSA doing to help agencies in this area?
Yes, this is Tom. So I'll jump in because, again, Rosa's brought up some good points. Matt has too, and you touched on them. And I think in one of the Q&A questions from, I believe it was Kevin, also touched on the dynamic of the space we're in right now. So, whether it's Section 889, which has been around for several years now, and we've got explicit, FAR clauses incorporated in various contract language today. And then I put those in the Q&A response, back to him. But in the absence of those, and Rosa and I deal with this regularly in various forums, like, in the absence of a explicit FAR, policy in place or a FAR rule in place, what do you do, right? So, you can incorporate things into your contract language to address it, directly with the vendors. And in the case of, use case example with one of the IT products, blanket purchase agreements that we have a lot of that vendor risk assessment, efforts and continuous monitoring activities that Matt alluded to earlier as well, where we take that information and then apply it to compliance with those various clauses and representations, especially with the prohibited sources for Section 89, where you use that information, and again, no entity's perfect, doesn't matter whether it's industry or us as a government whole, attesting to something is one thing, validating and verifying that is quite a bit different to that. And so that's what we're really getting at, is that, taking it that next step beyond attestation, to get to that compliance aspect and trying to take some of that complexity out, for our federal wide government partners that leverage GSA in that capacity, to where it's like, hey, we found something, you give the vendor the opportunity to take the corrective action to fix it. And again, Section 889 is very broad. It's 5G, it's security surveillance equipment, and it's not just sell it, it's use it. And so again, those interpretations. So we found a lot of that using some of these tools, in direct application with some of our resellers, to where we found, surveillance equipment within their warehouses. Because again, that's how you do security effectively, right? You're monitoring things. So we found, prohibited source surveillance equipment and cameras in their facilities, using the tools and the resources at our disposal to highlight that and enable the vendor to correct it, get those things out of the system, so again, that they will be compliant. And then, the mergers and acquisitions that Rosa kind of spoke to as well, it's like there may be, those happen routinely and regularly. We've had foreign ownership issues pop up within, and using those tools and resources to identify and flag those and take the appropriate action. If that means removal, or suspension of their contract, then that's the outcome associated with that. And we do that, as required. I know one of the other points that was made in the Q&A too, with the supply chain disruption that we're all living with and still living with, the impact on the disruption of getting things or having to go second source or alternate source third party, where you're exposing yourself to that potential additional risk. Things that are the big challenge that we deal with, and Matt and his team deal with as well, is, again, the white labeling, where it's kind of rebranded by somebody else. And that's a very, very hard challenge to overcome, because the resellers we deal with or the vendors we deal with may not know that. They're just taking a product from another name brand entity. And it's like, you don't know that until you dig deeper, and get access to some of these tools like GSA and other federal agencies are now bringing into their arsenal, to try to address that.
So Tom, let me jump in here. I appreciate you sharing this. So let me see if I can sort of synthesize everything I've heard you say so far. What I've heard you say is, from a supply chain perspective, we're doing a lot to do a deeper sort of evaluation or assessment on the items that are on our contracts. What I thought I heard you say was, before they get on contract, we're doing a deeper assessment to one, make sure that they are not part of the covered telecom equipment as part of Section 889. I also heard we're looking at things like white labeling, and you describe what white labeling is taking a prohibited telecom equipment and slapping a new name on it or a new brand on it and selling it as though it's something different. And I think it's incredible that you guys are able to catch that sort of thing. And I can only imagine sort of the data sources and how much work it takes to do that. And then I also heard you say that you are looking from an ownership perspective to figure out, if these mergers and acquisitions are happening all the time, who actually are any of these entities connected to excuse me, let me back up for a second. Are any of our vendors connected to the covered entities as part of Section 889 that are, I think it's ZTE, Huawei, and a few others that we can't do business with? So I think that's incredible that you guys are doing this. And it sounds like quite a bit of work that you are taking off of the plates of agencies to have to do. So kudos to you guys there. So in the interest of time, I want to thank you for that. I really appreciate that answer. I want to skip over really quickly to Barry, Barry Hodges. So Barry, you're the cloud guy, or like you're the person that sort of knows about where we're going cloud wise, and a big part of what I hear about in the cloud space as it relates to cybersecurity is the FedRAMP program. So how does FedRAMP fit into the government cybersecurity strategy, and what do buyers and IT professionals need to know about it?
That's a great question. And I'll actually tie this back into the conversation we were just having on secure software development and supply chain risk management. Tom alluded to the fact that, there's going to be a progression where we're moving from attestation to more validation and actual verification of what the attestation has underlying it. I equate FedRAMP to being the next evolution, where that validation and assessment is actually happening in the FedRAMP program. So it's a little bit more evolved in the cloud space than I think we see in the software development space. To answer your question directly, FedRAMP is essential to cybersecurity in the cloud environment. It's the one mechanism that's been developed to standardize how security assessments are done and risk assessments are done. It establishes how you do authorizations in cloud environments, and it establishes processes for continuous monitoring after you've deployed into the cloud. This saves agencies in mission areas a lot of duplicative work, because across federal government, FedRAMP is doing all of the common security baselining and authorization on behalf of other federal agencies. And federal agencies can then take that baseline and operate the next level higher at the higher levels of the technology stack. So again, FedRAMP is essential. It is the next evolution of what we just talked about in the software space. That's what it does. It adds that next layer of verification and validation to the attestation that it sets up in the first place.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense to me. I think we're seeing sort of similar models being adopted here, which makes a ton of sense to me. So, Barry, thank you for that. I really appreciate that answer. Let me come to you, Patricia. So, Patricia, you are working on the next generation of IT government-wide acquisition contracts, right? Specifically, Polaris and Alliance 3. And these are going to be some fairly heavily used vehicles, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, I think last fiscal year, I should say, over 10 billion, maybe 12 billion flowing through Alliance, if I'm not mistaken, or Line 2, and all the GWACs. And I could be off on that number. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Yeah, you're correct.
Okay, great. And so, how is your team addressing these new cyber requirements?
So we're working really hard on developing the new solicitations for both Polaris and Alliant 3, and we'll be incorporating a lot of the cybersecurity and security references into the solicitations and subsequently the contract at the base contract level. This means that contractors will really be required to comply with all existing requirements, security requirements, and implement new requirements as well.
That makes a lot of sense to me. That makes a lot of sense. And so what new requirements would you say you're anticipating? Do you have any specific in mind, or are we just talking about some of the stuff we've already heard?
Some of the things that we've talked about thus far, and updating new requirements as policy changes as we go along, which I think is, just inevitable as new threats pop up, new policies or requirements or even standards, will be prevalent in our contracts. We'll probably be constantly updating things as these things come down the pike.
Yeah, no, and I certainly appreciate that you and your team are thinking about this, because it makes life easier for the folks that need to buy through the vehicles to make sure they're in compliance. So thank you for that, Patricia. Rosa, I have a question that has, it's one of the questions that often comes up for me, and I have to admit that I'm a bit of a newbie on this. So I'm going to ask you to explain this to me like I'm a 5-year-old, right? So there's a lot of talk these days about the zero trust architecture. What is that, and why should we care about that?
So, short answer, what is zero trust? It means trust no one. In past years, decades, if you will, we were looking at the threats as being external to an organization. Zero trust looks at both the external threats as well as potential internal threats. Going back to what I said before about the possibilities of a disgruntled employee, for example, and that employee doesn't necessarily need to be no longer working for the organization. It could be someone that's still, employed. So you're looking at those types of things, in addition to not just someone who has, malicious intent that's working for an organization. It could be someone who mistakenly does something. I'm going to refer to something that happened recently with the Veterans Administration. Right now, they are in the midst of investigating a potential breach that occurred, or I should say an incident that occurred a few months ago, where a federal contractor unfortunately exposed the agency's source code to the public. So that right there, whether it's a malicious intent or an accident, it's still a type of internal threat. So when you talk about zero trust, is looking at those external as well as those internal threats. And with the model itself, let me take a step back. When you've also heard just zero trust, you may have heard zero trust architecture. The zero trust architecture portion of it, or zero ZTA, that is how the network is designed to prevent those unauthorized access to, and also limit, say, for example, lateral movement. And when I say lateral movement, if for whatever reason there is a network penetration, for example, that person or entity with zero trust in place, the way the architecture is designed, they can't move around the network. They should not be able to move around the network. So, and it's also looking at, for example, privileges and credentials. So, for example, the janitor or custodian should not have the same privileges as the person working at the IT help desk, right? The executive, for example, should not have the same privileges as the person at the IT help desk. Just because you're an executive does not mean you need to have administrative privileges. So that's the zero trust aspect of it. There's a lot more to it. a lot more technical details to it, but in general, it's trust no one.
I see. And I think, thank you for that, because I think it makes a little bit more sense to me now. So I suppose a follow-on question might be, how do you expect this push towards a zero trust architecture to impact how agencies conceptualize of new IT requirements and ultimately buy them?
Good, that's a good question. When you look at, I'm going to go to the executive order, Section 3. Section 3 lays out a lot of things for zero trust. But when you start looking at some of the memoranda, for example, 2131. 2131 is very prescriptive what agencies need to do when it comes to their endpoint detection or response. So that may require some additional tools or services that need to be implemented to address what is required in that memo to help agencies meet those milestones. It could be, like I said, a new device. It could be the need to bring in a consultant. It could be various things. So that's where the acquisition side of it comes in to play. Now, one thing about that particular memo, there are requirements for CISA to help agencies determine certain needs. So from an acquisitions perspective, those who are working with agencies should understand that in developing the requirements to meet the milestones in that particular memo, they need to go over to CISA, and CISA has recommendations and sets forth some of the requirements to help with that. And that kind of takes some of the burden off of the program managers and the acquisition people when it comes to writing the requirements. There's a clear understanding that CISA has laid out of certain requirements that are needed in order to facilitate the acquisition of the whether it's a service or a particular tool.
Gotcha. And thank you for that explanation. I think it again helps me understand where we're going with this. So if the folks on the phone, if you're a newbie like me, I guess, and Rosa, this is a follow-up question to you. If you're a newbie like me trying to wrap your head around zero trust and buying within this sort of new context, are there any resources, or how can they get help from GSA to do that? Just curious.
Yeah, so first let me say this: zero trust is not one solution. It's not one device, it's not one person, it's not one team, it's many things. It's looking at the governance side as well, because you want to make sure that whatever you implement to facilitate a zero trust security model, that it's working. So let me preface with that. As far as what resources are available, GSA, we do have a zero trust webpage. It's gsa.gov/ZTA, and there are lots of resources as well as a few training videos that will help you, whether you're at the beginning of your journey to zero trust, or you may be a little bit advanced in your zero trust journey. But there are resources there, whether it's the particular memo specifically for zero trust, and that's IMA 2209. And there's also the buyer's guide. One thing I can say, the buyer's guide is very detailed in looking at some of those zero trust principles outlined by NIST, as well as what CISA has provided with, in collaboration with the NSA. There are products that kind of map to the components of NIST, their tenets when it comes to the zero trust principles. Good document to have. Keep it at the nightstand, I would say, because it is a good document to have. And then also on the zero trust page that we have, there is a reference to OMB's zero trust webpage, where you have the cloud reference security architecture document that helps if you're moving toward the cloud. And I did put that link into the chat, as well as the overall strategy for moving toward zero trust. So those are some of the resources. There are other resources looking at certain vehicles that are available, whether it's a GWAC vehicle, looking at EIS, you know, when you come into Section 3 of the EO, there is language for IT modernization. That's important. You know, some of the legacy items out there, whether it's software or devices, they have weaknesses, and in some cases they may not, you know, be supported. So you have to make sure that you look overall where to modernize and where it would be beneficial to incorporate some of those changes outlined in the EO.
No, thank you for that. And that website again is gsa.gov/CTA.
Correct.
Correct. Great. Okay. Thank you for that. Now, Rosa, I know we only have 5 more minutes. There's a question I have been dying to ask, because I said at the start of this conversation that part of my role is to figure out what's coming next and to anticipate what's coming next and to build a contract vehicles of the future. And I got to tell you, one of the things that probably scares the bejesus out of me right now is where we're going with artificial intelligence and quantum computing and its impact on cyber threats. Could you talk for 2 minutes on what you expect coming down the pike and how we might begin to even think about that?
So I would say AI right now is already being used. When you start looking at some of the tools, like for example, your security operations centers might be using, whether it's predictive analysis or predictive analytics, threat modeling, in some cases, you know, even adversarial simulation, you know, kind of getting an understanding what may happen next or what a particular entity may be thinking, their techniques, and emulating their techniques. As far as quantum, that's a whole different 2-hour discussion. But quantum, when you look at what CISA recently released, they released some guidance. I think it's been a couple of months now, maybe August. It's preparing critical infrastructure, something along those lines. I do apologize. But in that guidance, it discusses the risk associated with quantum and looking at the acquisition side of it, taking those things in consideration. What NIST has been doing, NIST has been working to identify secure algorithms that can withstand potential attacks when we get into that post-quantum era. But NIST is, I'm sorry, not NIST, CISA has already taken in consideration the risk. They've already issued guidance. They've already issued things that should be considered when from the acquisitions perspective.
Well, thank you for that. And just if anyone was wondering what scares the bejesus out of me right now, it's learning that the quantum computers can break some of the hardest encryption that we have today within minutes, right? And that scares me. Yep. And so I'm sure it's a whole nother conversation, and we only have 2 more minutes on this webinar. So I want to take some time really just to thank the audience today for hopping on with us. I know this is an hour in your day. Hopefully you got some value out of this conversation. I also want to thank the panelists as well and the organizers of this event for helping us put this together. This is a really robust discussion, and you do have our email addresses listed on the screen. If you have any interest in any of the things that were discussed today, or if there are any questions you have about resources, or quite frankly, you just need to wrap your head around some of this stuff, because this is quite frankly really, really heady stuff. If you're in that space right now and you want to get some support, feel free to reach out to any of us. Our email addresses are listed on the screen, and we would be more than happy to walk you through what we know and help you prepare for what we know is coming, not only now, but coming in the future. Okay. So with that, I say thank you to everyone else. I don't believe we have any more questions. It's my understanding a lot of the questions have been answered in the Q&A. And so I think with that, we are done. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.